I'll spin you a tale, a true front porch story about a boy named Elias and the brightest thing he ever saw, which wasn't the sun, but the smile of a girl. This whole story hangs on a piece of bright white paint and a pair of worn-out, down-on-their-luck shoes, the kind that whispered promises they couldn't keep every time Elias took a step. Elias lived in a hollow where the dust was thicker than hope, and everything he owned, from his overalls to his very spirit, felt like it was touched by the same brown, weary color of the dry earth. He had his good heart, that was true, but a good heart don't shine like a good pair of shoes. Not when you're 17 and trying to catch the eye of a certain young lady. And that young lady, she was Lila, daughter of the town's only proper baker, and she moved through the world like she had light inside her. Light that seemed to bounce right off her clean, store-bought sneakers. He watched her every Sunday, standing by the tall oak, and every Sunday, he tucked his scuffed leather feet back under the bench, afraid his poverty was too loud, too visible, too close to the ground. The conflict wasn't the town, or his family, or his work. The conflict was the distance between his old, honest life and the shimmering possibility of a new one. A life that only Lila seemed to hold the key to. And that key, he decided, had to be turned by a pair of pristine, snowy white shoes. This wasn't vanity, not exactly. It was the desperate, beautiful cunning of a poor boy needing a disguise, needing just one night to stand tall without the world seeing the holes in his soles. The dust of the hollow, you see, was just waiting to swallow him whole. But he had a new idea now, a grand, secret idea that made his heart thump like a drum on the 4th of July. Now, Elias thought on that white paint for 3 long nights, counting the pennies he had managed to squirrel away from running errands for old Mr. Hemlock. He didn't have money for new shoes, not even close, but he had enough for a small tin of the glossiest, most housefront trim white paint sold down at the general store. It was the kind of paint meant to keep the rain out, not the kind meant to impress a baker's daughter, but Elias didn't know the difference, or maybe he just didn't care. The desperate idea had taken root, and like a stubborn kudzu vine, it just kept growing until it covered every bit of his common sense. The shoes themselves were a pitiful sight, hand-me-downs from his older cousin, Ben, who had worn them through 2 seasons of hard labor until the leather was cracked like dry river mud and the laces were thin as old string. But to Elias, they were the canvas of his future, the one bridge he could build between his world and Lila's. The very act of deciding felt like a trespass, a secret whispered only to the shadows of the woodshed where he kept his tools. He knew Ben would laugh, a harsh, barking sound, if he ever found out. And the grown-ups, they'd shake their heads and murmur about foolish pride, about a boy who didn't know his place. But when a boy's heart is set on a light like Lila's, the good advice and the sensible warnings just fall away like dry leaves. He felt the pull of the subconscious, a deep certainty that this small, fraudulent act was the necessary spark to ignite everything else. It was the only way to climb out of the invisibility that poverty had wrapped around him like a shawl. He had to be bold. He had to take a risk. And so he waited until the moon was hidden behind the clouds, and he crept out, carrying his pathetic shoes and the promising white tin like treasure. The painting began, slow and clumsy, out behind the shed where the smell of pine and damp earth could cover the sharp, chemical tang of the enamel. Elias wasn't an artist. He was just a boy with a brush and a prayer. He laid the shoes out on an old piece of newspaper, careful not to get any dust on them, and he dipped the brush in the thick, glossy white. The first stroke was terrifying, a commitment to the lie, a permanent alteration of his reality. The paint didn't soak in. It sat on top of the old, cracked leather like a fresh layer of snow on rocky ground. He had to paint thick, heavy strokes, ignoring the way the old scars and wrinkles of the leather still showed faintly underneath. He worked with a feverish intensity, his own breathing the only sound. It took 2 coats, spread over the entire surface, covering the scuffs, the tears, and the very memory of the dirt they had carried. The white was so brilliant in the dim lantern light that it almost hurt his eyes. He realized then that the shoes weren't just a disguise. They were a beacon, and beacons could attract attention, the wrong kind of attention. This heightened the suspense. This magnificent fraud was not only fragile but also loud. He worked feverishly, ignoring the way his hands shook. He even painted the laces, laying them out straight to dry, making them stiff and unnaturally crisp. When he was done, he stood back, his heart hammering. They didn't look new. They looked different, like a dream of new shoes, perfect, artificial, and utterly captivating. He hung them high up on a nail inside the shed, safe from the dew and the morning sun, knowing he had to wait a full 2 days for them to cure, 2 days of living this heavy secret that pressed down on his chest. 2 days felt like 2 years, filled with the constant, anxious checking of the shoes, poking them gently to ensure the paint was hard, not tacky. Elias did his chores with half a mind, his eyes always darting toward the shed, and the rhythmic monotony of his life was replaced by a nervous, electric anticipation. He told no one, not his ma, not his little sister, for a secret shared is a secret halved, and he needed the full weight of this deception to feel real. The paint had dried to a hard porcelain finish, and when he finally took them down on Saturday morning, they felt strangely light, lighter than the old, worn leather they had been, almost weightless with the promise they carried. He put them on, slowly, carefully, sitting on the edge of the dusty porch. They pinched a little, being stiff with paint now, but he ignored the discomfort. Stepping down onto the dirt yard, he paused, a moment of true soul-deep terror. The white was blinding against the brown dust. It was a scandal. It was a statement. It was a glorious, impossible thing to wear in the hollow. He walked toward the well, his gait naturally changing. He had to step high, carefully, gently, suddenly aware of every patch of gravel, every muddy divot. The shoes dictated his movement, instilling an unnatural, almost royal posture. This was the core of the change. The shoes weren't just covering his feet. They were changing him, forcing him to walk with a confidence he didn't naturally possess. The white shoes were a silent system instruction for a new persona. He saw his reflection in the water bucket. Not just Elias, but Elias in the white shoes, and the white shoes made the rest of him look cleaner, taller, worthier. This was the Saturday before the Sunday social, the night he would finally walk past the oak tree and maybe, just maybe, speak to Lila. The suspense was almost unbearable, a wire pulled taut across his soul, waiting for the first step on the main town street. Saturday night, the town's weekly social was held in the open-air pavilion, a place where the rich and the poor mingled under the same string of borrowed electric lights. Elias, scrubbed clean and wearing his best, though threadbare, pressed shirt, walked the half-mile into town, the painted shoes clicking slightly on the asphalt, a sound both sharp and alien to his ears. Each step was a commitment, a note in a secret song only he knew. He noticed the first glances immediately. Old Mr. Hemlock, who usually didn't bother to nod, looked down, then up, then back at the shoes with a puzzled frown. The shoes drew the eye like a moth to a flame, and in their pristine whiteness, they demanded respect. It wasn't the respect for wealth. It was the respect for mystery, for something that didn't belong. He felt the nervous energy drain away, replaced by a cool, smooth confidence, the kind of easy feeling that belonged to a boy who wore white shoes and didn't worry about the dirt. He found Lila by the punch bowl, laughing with a cluster of other girls. She was wearing a simple yellow dress, and the sight of her sent a familiar, thrilling tremor through his chest. He took a deep breath, remembered the pain and the effort of the 2 coats of paint, and started walking toward her. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then Lila looked up. Her eyes, the color of warm river stone, passed over his face, hesitated, and then dropped to his feet. She didn't frown. She didn't laugh. She just stopped smiling, just for a moment, and her expression was one of genuine, quiet curiosity. This was the moment he had risked everything for, the subtle shift from invisible poor boy to intriguing stranger. He managed a simple, "Good evening, Lila," and the sound of his own voice, steady and calm, surprised him. The painted shoes, his silent accomplice, had done their job. They were the conversation starter, the thing that broke the spell of his shyness. Lila's initial curiosity deepened. She tilted her head, and her eyes stayed on the shoes a moment longer than was necessary. "Elias?" she replied, her voice soft, like water running over smooth stones. I don't believe I've ever seen those before. They're very clean. Not a compliment, not a question, just a simple observation that acknowledged his new reality. The other girls, dressed in their town best and whispering behind their hands, seemed to fade away. It was just Elias and Lila, connected by a flimsy, painted bridge. The conflict now entered a new, internal phase. Could he sustain the image? He dared not scuff them, dared not sit down too carelessly. He was living inside a glass house, a white, brittle shell of his own making. He and Lila talked about the music, the warm night, and the way the lights caught the dust motes in the air. He found himself speaking with an ease he hadn't known he possessed, the confidence blooming from his soles up to his tongue. When he saw Ben, his cousin, across the floor, Ben gave him a look of profound, challenging surprise. A look that said, "Where did you get those?" The suspense ratcheted up again. The first challenge was not the dirt, but the scrutiny of someone who knew the truth of his old shoes. Elias held Lila's gaze, ignoring Ben completely, and for that moment, he truly was the boy with the clean, white shoes, a boy who belonged exactly where he stood. Ben, a lanky, sharp-eyed fellow with a competitive streak as long as a county road, didn't let the mystery rest. He sidled over later, his own work boots scuffed and honest, a knowing smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth. "Well, look here," he drawled, not looking at Elias's face, but openly staring at the shoes. "Elias got religion, I reckon. That's a bright white, 'cause, where'd you dig up that pair? I ain't seen a shine like that since Ma painted the front gate." The words were casual, but the tone was laced with challenge, the specific suspicion of a family member who knows the financial geography of the whole clan. Elias felt a cold prickle of fear, the danger of the fragile paint being exposed. He had to be quick, smooth, and utterly convincing. "Found 'em tucked away in the back of the shed," Elias replied, his voice flat, trying to sound bored, as if white shoes were just a common, tiresome thing he'd decided to throw on. "Cleaned 'em up good. Been needing a pair for Sundays." It was a half-lie, the kind that rested on an old truth, but the simple explanation didn't satisfy Ben. Ben was the physical manifestation of the external conflict, the skeptical eye of the world. He reached down, as if to casually brush a speck of dust, and Elias's entire body tensed, ready to flinch away. This small, predatory action made Elias feel the vulnerability of his secret right down to his bones. He knew that the paint was thin in places, especially around the creases, and a hard rub might reveal the dark, honest leather underneath. But before Ben's hand could make contact, Lila stepped in, her hand resting lightly on Elias's elbow. A simple, protective gesture that stunned them both. Lila's intervention was a turning point, a silent declaration of favor that immediately checked Ben's casual aggression. "Ben, don't you go bothering Elias about his shoes," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying the specific weight of the baker's daughter speaking to the poor boy's cousin. "They look nice. You wouldn't know nice if it walked up and kissed your hand." Ben recoiled slightly, not used to being dismissed, especially not by Lila, whom he also admired from a distance. He mumbled a retreat, his eyes narrowed, now holding not just suspicion of the shoes, but resentment toward Elias. The simple white paint had inadvertently thrown Elias into a love triangle, a new conflict that was purely emotional and entirely unexpected. Elias felt a sudden, fierce loyalty to Lila and a soaring confidence that came not from the shoes, but from her defense. He understood then, in a deep, intuitive flash that connected to the subconscious. The shoes were a catalyst, not the cause. They merely provided the initial platform, the reason for Lila to look and stay. Now that she had stepped into his space, the deception felt less like a risk and more like a successful, if temporary, strategy. He spent the rest of the evening by her side, talking about silly things, the shapes of the clouds, the secret to his ma's apple pie, and he never once stopped being aware of the delicate, crisp white of his footwear. As he walked Lila back toward the bakery, his steps were lighter than air, dancing around the inevitable truth that lay hidden beneath the bright enamel, a truth the world, and now Ben, were waiting to expose. The week that followed was a dizzying change. Elias found himself invited to places he'd never been, mostly because Lila was there, and she now saw him as someone different. They walked by the creek after his workday, and he had to perform mental geometry to navigate the path, always keeping his feet on the driest pebbles, avoiding the slick moss and the occasional mud patch. Every walk became an act of intense, low-stakes suspense, a silent war against the elements. The shoes, which had gifted him confidence, now burdened him with constant, vigilant worry. He worried about the sudden summer rain, the one that could turn the dusty path into a ruinous sludge pit in 5 minutes flat. He found himself constantly rubbing a small, smooth stone over the surface, a ritual of preservation, smoothing away the tiny fissures that threatened to widen and reveal the truth. Lila seemed utterly oblivious to his hyper-awareness of the ground. She talked about her dreams, not the small-town dreams, but grand ones of leaving the hollow, maybe studying design, making things beautiful. This creative synergy, her aspirations feeding his own secret ambition, made the fraud all the sweeter and the risk all the greater. He realized that the greatest danger wasn't Ben's mockery, but the moment when the paint might crack and shatter the image of the boy who could keep anything, even shoes, so pristine. This simple pair of shoes had now become the physical manifestation of his emotional vulnerability, a brittle barrier between his true self and the person he desperately wanted to become. The first major crisis arrived midweek, sudden and theatrical. Elias was helping his neighbor, old Mama Clara, carry a load of fresh-cut wood from her yard when the sky, which had been clear and blue, ripped open in a classic violent southern downpour. It wasn't just rain. It was a cloudburst, water falling in sheets thick enough to blind a man. Elias looked down at the newly formed stream running down the dirt road, and his heart dropped like a stone into a deep well. The painted shoes. Mama Clara, who moved with a slow, deliberate grace, just smiled. "Run, child, or you'll be soaked to the bone and catch your death." But Elias couldn't run. He couldn't risk the water soaking through the paint and lifting it right off the leather in strips. The panic was immediate and physical, a cold wave washing over him. He abandoned the wood, muttered a quick apology, and broke into a desperate, clumsy sprint toward the nearest cover, which was the awning of the closed feed store. He slipped once, catching himself quickly, but the sight of the water splashing near his pristine footwear sent a shot of adrenaline through him. He huddled under the awning, breathing heavily, watching the streets turn into coffee-colored rivers. The shoes were damp, dark with water where the paint was thinnest, but they were holding. The suspense was excruciating, the tiny, almost undetectable streaks of brown dust running down the white surface were like hairline cracks in his story. He realized he was standing there, shaking not from the cold, but from the fear of a ruined reputation. The fear of the physical world destroying his fragile, emotional bridge to Lila. This single, painted artifact now held the entirety of his social standing. The near disaster of the rain deepened Elias's paranoia and increased his commitment to the deceit. He spent the rest of that evening carefully drying the shoes with a rag, holding them over the warm oven, praying they wouldn't warp or flake. The experience taught him a painful lesson. The paint wasn't a shield. It was a veneer, demanding constant maintenance and vigilance. He started carrying a small, white handkerchief in his pocket, a secret weapon to instantly dab away any stray speck of dirt. He was becoming a caricature of carefulness, a boy whose whole world centered on avoiding mud. This change in behavior, this excessive fastidiousness, did not go unnoticed. Lila, observant and kind, commented on it gently. "You're always watching the ground, Elias," she said one afternoon as they sat by the river, their feet dangling near the water's edge. "Are you afraid of snakes?" Elias managed a weak smile. "Just a habit, Lila. Don't want to ruin a good pair of shoes." The lie felt heavy and clumsy on his tongue now, but he couldn't stop. The shoes had taken him this far. He felt trapped by their success. The fear of being exposed had become a greater driving force than the initial desire to impress. This was the crux of the moral conflict. Maintaining the lie was essential for maintaining the relationship, but every fresh coat of confidence was layered over an increasingly guilty heart. The longer he went without telling her, the larger the secret grew, swelling until it felt like a separate presence walking beside them. Ben, in the meantime, was still circling the truth like a buzzard. He saw Elias's exaggerated care, the way he hesitated before crossing the gravel lot, and the way he instinctively lifted his feet over every little puddle. Ben wasn't a malicious person, but he was competitive and deeply unsettled by Elias's sudden elevation in status, especially with Lila. The mysterious, perfect shoes were a disruption to the known order of the hollow, and Ben felt a natural, poor man's instinct to restore balance. One afternoon, he found Elias alone by the old tire swing, inspecting a tiny chip on the side of one shoe. "You keep that white like a porcelain doll, 'cause," Ben remarked, leaning against the tree. "Tell me true, did you use that high-gloss stuff from the store? The kind Ma uses on the outhouse trim?" Elias froze, the handkerchief still against the shoe. The directness of the question was a shock. He knew Ben was close to the heart of the matter. The very name of the paint, associated with the common, mundane task of house repair, threatened to strip the shoes of their magic. Elias met his eye, trying to project a calm superiority. "It's just good care, Ben. You should try it sometime. A little oil, a little polish." He lied again, easily, the habit cemented. But the conflict was now open. Ben didn't push. He simply smiled, a slow, knowing smile that was more devastating than any accusation. "Right?" Ben said, pushing off the tree. "We'll see how good care holds up next Saturday at the Founders' Day picnic. That's a good 3-mile walk through the creek bottom. Plenty of good, honest dirt down there." It was a challenge, a subtle, environmental dare that Elias couldn't refuse without confirming Ben's suspicions.